Hello, students. This is Professor Gore, and this is part four of Exploration and Colonization recorded lecture. And so in this one, we're going to be talking about New Spain. At least that's what the Spanish government called it, and that is the Spanish colonial empire in the Western Hemisphere. And this is going to extend all the way up into New Mexico and northern and parts of California, down to Florida as part of the United States, but also primarily in Mexico, South America, and the Caribbean. And so I want to show you this map because this kind of shows you and to be able to kind of visually be able to see Spain's empire at its height in the Western Hemisphere. And so what Spain is able to do militarily is very impressive. Of course, the spread of disease with the climate exchange is going to play a big role in that. Let's go by 1797. This is a few years after the American Revolution, before the turn of the century in 1800. New Spain was by far the most extensive territory of all the European powers. It's going to be more territory than France, more territory than Portugal, more territory than Great Britain. Even the Dutch who settle in a couple sugar islands and up in present-day New York, it is by far going to be the most extensive of all the European maritime-based empires. And so there was a variety of forces behind this. You have technology, okay, so you have guns. You also have ships that allow them to get places much easier. You also have steel swords that were far better than the Native American weapons that oftentimes did not have any metal. They were like obsidian arrows and stone axes and so forth. They also were very centralized and authoritative power. They were very efficient at government, and also good old-fashioned disease, smallpox, typhoid fever, typhus, malaria, the flu. Those things are going to ravage Native American civilizations, these areas, particularly where Spain is going. The climate was so conducive for these diseases spreading. You know, if you're in the cold region around the Great Lakes, the smallpox doesn't spread as rapidly as it does in tropical, more humid climates and so forth. And so that's going to play a role. So the Spanish were the first to really bring diseases. Of course, Portuguese do as well, and the French and the British do, and even the Dutch to a smaller extent. But Spain is going to have the greatest impact with its spread of disease. Smallpox devastated the Aztecs, and particularly the Caribbean natives, particularly because of the environment and the climate there. The Spanish encountered the Aztecs in Mexico, the Incas in Peru, and another smaller civilization in Colombia that's kind of get forgotten in world history. In the service of God, as well as the search of gold and glory, Spanish conquistadors, which is Spanish for conquerors, fanned out across the Caribbean and eventually into the mainland of the American continents. Okay, so why was Spain the most extensive? Well, like I said, technology, centralized authoritative power, and particularly disease. You can't understate the importance of disease. Also, one of the things that Spain did is they were very wise to gain the alliance of enemies of the Aztecs or Mexica people, because they were very ruthless and oppressive. And so they were able to take advantage of them. And so now Cortez is actually going to use a female translator to gain their alliance that allows him to win. He's going to have about 200,000 Native American allies. Without that, Cortez is not successful. Okay, and so hope you like that. So who are these conquistadors? Conquistadors, I like to tell students over the years, these are not exactly the men you want to bring home to mom as proud as this is going to be your future son-in-law. Your mom would probably pass out. The conquistadors were guys who made a living from warfare. These were Spanish soldiers who had made a living as fighting the Moors in Granada in the Reconquista, where Spain had retaken all of the Iberian Peninsula, with the exception of Portugal, which is already its own country, from the Muslim Moors of their origin from North Africa. And so these conquistadors are going to claim to be Christians, but they're not really going to be very Christ-like to a lot of the people they're subjugating, and so forth. Now, the priests are going to come in, and it depends on what area you're talking about, how they were treated by the Spanish priests and so forth. Let's look at Hernan Cortez, one of the greatest conquerors world history, also one of the luckiest individuals of world history. And so what Cortez does is he was a young conquistador who wanted to make a name for himself. And so he had arrived in Santo Domingo, okay, present day Dominican Republic, and he decided to raise up some soldiers. He recruited about 600 soldiers and about 200 Cuban natives. They're kind of a forgotten group in world history, but they were part of this expedition. And so he had found a guide through the Mayan people named Mala Nali, who served as both his interpreter, but Cortez also forced her to be his mistress. Cortez was not exactly a guy that we can look at his life as being very impressive in terms of integrity. But Cortez was able to use her to gain the allegiance of some of these rivals, because the Mayan people had, the descendants of them had been subjugated by the Aztecs. And so what ends up happening is Cortez steals ships. Okay, he steals Spanish ships and sails to the Mexican mainland. From there, they began. He actually burns his ships to motivate his soldiers to be victorious or death, which if you think about it, was very foolish. But nonetheless, he burns them, and they began moving inland. And so, awed by the military prowess of the Spanish invaders, Montezuma, who is right there on the right, received Cortez with great ceremony. But Cortez is ruthlessly going to capture Montezuma and eventually kill him. When the emperor's supporters tried to expel the invaders, they faced superior European military technology. And so these Aztec warriors were no match for the mounted conquistadors. Particularly, you think about this, if you're the Aztecs and you had never seen a horse, that's a large animal. And then you see somebody riding up on one. I mean, you can't blame them for feeling awe and wonder if these were some kind of godlike people. Okay. And so Cortez's men are heavily outnumbered and suffer great losses. Cortez and his men were able to fight their way out of the Aztec capital. The Aztecs had about 200,000 in their capital, Tenochtitlan, but Cortez is eventually going to come back with about 200,000 allies. And so what ends up happening, I think it's one of the great cases of luck of world history, really. I learned about this in grad school. Is Cortez and his men are fleeing because they were able to escape the capital city. They're far outnumbered by the numerous hundreds of thousands of Aztecs, and they're fleeing towards the coast. Okay, now they're cannons and firearms, and they take forever to reload, and so you can only kill so many that way. And so they're running towards the coast as fast as they can. Now, it's obviously over the course of several days and weeks to get all the way to the coast, but they're able to keep the Aztecs at bay. But when they get to the coast, you're thinking, well, their ships are burned. Why would they not be, killed and slaughtered on the beach? All right. Now, this is why I say Cortez is one of the luckiest people of world history. When he arrives at the beach, there is a Spanish naval group that are searching for these stolen ships. And I don't know if they found them the first day or within a few days of being on the beach. But the Spanish, basically, Cortez is able to convince them, hey, don't hang me for theft or grand theft auto, grand ship auto. I've found this incredible civilization that's very wealthy. We can defeat them if we get reinforcements. And so what ends up happening is instead of Cortez getting hung, which probably would have happened otherwise, he ends up convincing the Spanish to reinforce him. And then what he does, using his translator or also his mistress, he is able to go back and get about 200,000 Native American allies because they were being very oppressed by the Aztecs or Mexican people. And they go back in and they defeat the Aztecs. The Aztecs put up a pretty good fight, but they are defeated. Also, you have smallpox, influenza, and measles that breaks out that kills hundreds of thousands of the Aztecs. And so it really kind of that struck the morale. And you think about this, if you're one of the Aztec people, you think that the gods have shown disfavor on you and they have shown favor on these people that are conquering them. And so exploiting this demographic weakness, Cortez quickly extended the Spanish rule over the entire Aztec empire. His lieutenants then moved against the Mayan city-states in the Yucatan Peninsula and eventually conquering them as well. Now, Cortez, I used to read this to students, but his account that he writes to the Spanish king about this incredible civilization, he was doing this for a couple reasons. One, he was hoping the king would pardon him for his theft. Okay, but also making him out to be this incredible civilization because he wanted to gain favor of the king and be appointed as a governor of Mexico, which actually does happen. And so, but the Aztec Empire was impressive with their irrigation infrastructure and water sources and so forth. And this is some of the drawings of the Aztecs. Now, the Spanish conquistadors were quite ruthless, and some of them raped Aztec women and so forth. Okay. So this, you can take notes on this if you'd like, but this is Cortez, kind of the highlights of his success. And so Santo Domingo, right down here, and you can see the island of Hispaniola. Cuba's to the north, so it's actually the present-day Dominican Republic and Haiti, which later becomes a French colony, and so forth. And so from there, they go out and go into other areas. And so they eventually settle over here, and they go in this region and so forth. Also, you can see where there is mining. And the Spanish are going to extract some of the greatest amounts of gold and silver ever in world history. In fact, in Zacatecas in northern Mexico and Potosi in present-day Bolivia, they discovered the largest silver discoveries ever of world history. Okay, and they're going to bring so much material wealth back to Spain that is going to lead to inflation on the Mediterranean Sea trade. They're going to be bringing so much silver across the Pacific Ocean to the Philippines to trade with China that China ends up changing its entire currency to silver. You know how large China is. That's how vast amounts of mineral wealth that the Spanish are going to extract. Spain is also going to bring about slavery. They originally enslaved the Native Americans, but as they quickly died off from disease, they're going to replace them with African slaves. And the Portuguese are going to follow suit in Brazil as well. Okay, so let's talk about Pizarro and his crazy scheme of defeating the Incas. Now, Pizarro was also lucky, and timing is everything in world history. And so Francisco Pizarro had heard about this mighty and wealthy empire of Native Americans in present-day Peru and Ecuador and parts of Bolivia. And so the Spanish also are later going to defeat a smaller civilization in Colombia that kind of gets forgotten in world history. There's not as much evidence about them, but they do defeat them. But the Incas were far larger. And what had happened was by 1532, so Cortez had conquered the Aztecs in 1519. 1532, because of the trade network of Native Americans, disease is now spread down into the Incas. So you have a pandemic breakout of disease. Secondly, when the king dies of the Incas, his two sons fighting a civil war over the throne. Okay, so the Incas are weakened because of disease and civil war. Okay, so Pizarro rolls up with a small force and are going to defeat them. Okay, and so what ends up happening is in 1524, Francisco Pizarro set out. Okay, he doesn't conquer them until 1532, but nonetheless, he extends there. And this was a 2,000-mile empire. And what ends up happening is the Incas had laid out about 24,000 miles of roads. They developed some of the greatest road systems outside the Romans and the Chinese in world history. And so I've actually been on a bus on one of these Incan roads, and it's single lane, but still in use today by the Peruvian country. So the Incan king was seen as a semi-divine character, and he ruled with the help of hierarchical bureaucracy staffed by noblemen, and many of them the king's relatives. By the time Pizarro and a small force of 168 men, yes, 168 men, and 67 horses finally reached Peru in 1632, half of the Inca population died from European diseases spread by Indian traders. Weakened militarily and fighting over succession to the throne, the Inca nobility was easy prey for Pizarro's army. In the mere space of 16 years, Spain had become the master of the wealthiest and most populous regions of the Western Hemisphere. Okay, so what ends up happening is, this is a fascinating story. Pizarro and his men were going to meet the Incan ruler, and they had the priest with them. Now, Pizarro was a narcissist, kind of thought himself a godlike figure. Anyway, but the sign is that if they did anything to the Christian Bible, that was going to be a signal to fight. Now, these men are actually scared to death. In fact, some of these men, according to primary source records, probably wet their pants. But these 169 soldiers, along with some Native American troops, as well as they actually had about several African soldiers that they had brought over as well, who were kind of like bought as like slave soldiers, so to speak. And they do have firearms and swords and a few horses, 69 or so. But when they meet the Incan ruler, he's being carried on this platform, this like throne, by like 40 guys underneath him. I mean, geez, that looks like a guy looks like a boss. And so, but he's got 40,000 warriors that are facing off against the Spanish. So the Spanish are obviously scared to death. But because they were aggressive and took the initiative, is how they're going to prevail. But what ends up happening is the priest comes up and tries to hand the Incan king a Bible, and he looks at it and tosses it to the ground. Well, they're offended them, and so they end up firing. Now, if you think about this, if you're in the Andes Mountains, okay, anytime a cannon or gunshot's going to go off, it's going to echo. It's going to make it seem a lot louder than what it actually was. Well, if you've never seen a firearm before and you hear that thing go off with this crack of gunpowder igniting, and same thing with a cannon, you're going to be scared, and you have no idea that it takes forever for those things to reload. And so they fired and killed some of the individuals that were holding up the platform of the king, also fired into some of the archers. Now, all you got to think about is the 40,000 warriors would have fired their arrows a massive volley. It would have wiped out the Spanish and their African soldiers. Instead, they don't do it. They flee, and Pizarro and his men chase them down with horses, and they just cut them down with swords as they're fleeing. And so if they would have stood and fought, they would have defeated the Spanish just by sheer numbers. And so they end up killing the guys that were holding up the platform. They capture the leader of the Incas and eventually try to hold him for ransom, and then eventually kill him. And so what ends up happening is now Spain has got this incredible empire. And so what's going to end up happening is you're going to have these incredible trade networks that emerge with Spain's empire. I'm going to cover some other explorers here in just a second. I want to emphasize this, okay? This is what we call world history period 4. Okay, this is a period of globalization. Okay, look at these global trade networks that are taking place during the 15 and 1600s of world history. Now, instead of having just the Indian Ocean, Silk Road to a certain extent, which had declined quite a bit, the Mediterranean Sea trade, the Trans-Saharan trade, now you have this transatlantic trade. And that's going to actually end up surpassing the others in wealth eventually. Still, the Indian Ocean was heavily traded upon and very wealthy. And so, as I mentioned, the Spanish are going to take silver and sell over here. Of course, they're going to bring back silk bought in the Philippines from the Chinese. Also, you're going to have all kinds of things like eventually sugar is going to surpass silver and mineral wealth and prosperity. But that's going to come later, more so in the 16 and 1700s. But in the 1500s, it is gold and silver, baby. And then eventually Portugal is going to dominate, not fully dominate, but grow lots and lots of sugar along here along the Brazilian coast. But what's going to end up happening is these West African kingdoms are going to buy European manufactured goods, particularly guns and also rum that was made here in the Caribbean with sugar. It's a sugary alcohol, and then turn around and sell male slaves primarily. And these slaves are going to go in large numbers to the Caribbean, central Mexico, also here in northern the Guianas, and then down here a little bit into mining for the Incan Empire, and also particularly in Brazil for sugar plantations. Primarily going to go right here for sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Okay, so anyway, Pizarro is victorious and so forth, and this is actually an incredible Incan palace high up in Andes Mountains. It wasn't discovered until a plane flew over in the early 1900s. I've actually been there when I was a senior in college. It is considered one of the wonders of the world. It is a big tourist destination for people all over the world. Put it on your bucket list. It's incredible. Expensive. It was like $100 in like 2006 to enter the park, plus a train ride and the bus ticket up the mountain to get up there. But worth every penny. And I love to take my family there to see it one day themselves. And this right here is. You can see the incredible from aerial view of it. It is worth the price, I promise you. So if you look right here, look at all of the material wealth, the mineral wealth that Spain is bringing back. I mean, it's nuts. But the sad thing is they bring back so much that it leads to tremendous inflation. And it forever actually leads to Spain's decline. So they were, and plus the Spanish king fought a lot of religious wars with that gold by paying for soldiers and so forth, and a lot of it did kind of squandered it long term, and Spain's eventually going to be on the decline, especially when they lose the 7 Years' War in the 1700s. Also, their navy loses against England, against Queen Elizabeth. Okay, so these definitely look at this map to see all the different global trade that has taken place, and so now the Western Hemisphere, thanks to Columbus, creates the first permanent relationship between the East and Western hemispheres. You have now brought it into the global economy. Okay. Now let's look at some other explorers. I did forget to mention that the Aztecs do revolt the next year in 1520, but the Spanish are able to put them down. And then after they get reinforced in 1521, and then what ends up happening is, let's look at some other explorers. You have Juan Ponce de Leon, who explored Florida in 1513 and 1521, but eventually gets killed by an arrow. He had heard about this supposedly fountain of youth. It was probably a misinterpretation of the language barrier with Native Americans. It's possible that he was hearing about Hot Springs, Arkansas, because of the nature's hot tub. Kind of feel rejuvenated after getting out of that. Also, Panfilio de Narvaez explores Florida and Alabama, which kind of sounds like the beginning of an SEC rivalry. But ends up happening. They're trying to look for another gold material wealth empire like the Aztecs and Incas, but they're not going to find one. Hernan de Soto, one of history's great pricks, is going to explore the southeast, including Arkansas. He died in 1542, but about 311 of his men made it back. His men actually killed him. One of the priests that went with him on expeditions really, in his diary, talked about the horrible atrocities that de Soto did. They landed in present-day Tampa, Florida. And then, but he had spread disease, and he and a few of his men had raped Native American women, and anyway, did some terrible things. And so, not exactly a guy you want to take home to mom and be proud of. Also, in 1540s, Francisco Coronado explored the interior from northern New Mexico to Kansas after hearing gold north of Texas. And so, what ends up happening is he used this translator that he had found in central Mexico, who was mixed blood. His name was Enyante, and very highly intelligent guy. And so he forces Enyante to take him up to kind of the Great Plains states to try to find another clone empire. Now, one of the things that they probably misinterpreted was they'd heard about this gold trade. It was probably copper, Native American trade routes throughout the present-day United States. And so poor Enyante ends up getting killed because he can't find Coronado this empire, which didn't exist, but he thought it did. And Coronado wrote back to the Spanish government that there's Native Americans are walking around carrying jugs of bison blood, which actually was water. So Spain didn't come back to the area until 1598. So what ends up happening is it forever changes the course of, I guess, U.S. history, as they don't extend their empire further north. What they do is they create these military-based settlements, kind of like if you've ever seen the Alamo. That's what it would look like. These presidios. These are kind of like walled compounds, had a church and settlement, and they just had a small garrison of a few soldiers. So they kind of, as I've heard one guy say, they got all they canned all they got, set on the can. All right. So they basically just got the empire they thought they could hold in the southwest part of the United States, put the presidios there, these military wall compounds, and then called it a day, and so forth. And what ends up happening is they do establish about 60 settlements along the Rio Grande, but they were very brutal to the Pueblo Indians. They also created the first permanent European settlement in the United States in St. Augustine, Florida, in 1565. So it's the first European town in the U.S. And by 1630, they had about 50 churches and friaries in New Mexico with about 3,000 Spaniards, so pretty small population. Father Serras was a Catholic priest, went into California to carry on this missionary impulse from Spain. They created San Diego, Monterey, San Francisco. They also forced the natives to commit to their way of life. So they, instead of having multiple wives, they wanted them to be monogamous, be married, have family structure, moral codes, ways of working, ways of dress, and cutting of hair. And so, a lot of times Spanish get criticized for trying to force the Native Americans who were conquered to live their way of life. But that was true of pretty much most civilizations throughout world history. Is once you conquered them, you oftentimes try to assimilate them into your way of life. And Spain, instead of like having them willfully assimilate, they try to force assimilate them. And they would try to get Native Americans to come into their wall compounds, have them have a European style haircut, European style dress, and adopt Catholic Christianity. And so, but one thing you can't understate is the highly effectiveness of the Spanish at proselytizing to the Native Americans. And that's why a lot of Latin America is predominantly Catholic to this day. You can see here is where Coronado traveled. And Yante was another Spanish guy. I'm sorry. Coronado's guide, I've forgotten his name off the top of my head, but he comes and guides him out here. All right. So Balboa, I've covered. De Leon found a fountain of youth in Florida. Coronado explored the American Southwest into the Great Plains area. And De Soto explored the American Southeast. And Amerigo Vespucci is the first one where we get the name America from. Okay, so Amerigo is first name. Okay, so St. Augustine, first permanent settlement in the United States. I used to teach that for the STAR test or tax test when I taught Texas U.S. history. So one thing you want to understand, you want to highlight this, circle this, star this, whatever. But they set up presidios, okay, and these missions. These are military bases. And so were the Spanish expansive? Initially, yes, they were extremely expansive. But then once they felt like they got all they could get, they stopped. And so they ceased to be expansive. France and Great Britain is going to continue to be expansive in their colonial empires, as we'll see throughout Module 1. So they held on to what they had, at least in terms of U.S. history. Also, they forced their culture on the Native Americans. That's forced assimilation. And you think about an American Southwest, about 60,000 Native Americans, much smaller population than in central Mexico and the Caribbean because of the climate. It's very dry, can't support large populations. But by the 1730s, they had about 15,000. So you can see that population was decreased by 75% because of disease and so forth. Okay. Now, the impact of horses, we can't understate this. This is one of the coolest, I think, developments in at least in U.S. history, or what becomes U.S. history, is the fact that the Spanish brought horses, cows and pigs and so forth to their colonial empire in the Western Hemisphere. And Native Americans were just amazed at horses. Yeah, because they're an incredible domesticated animal. And what ends up happening, the reason why we have wild horses in the Great Plains later in history, is because some escaped. Native Americans would steal them. And so when the Spanish introduced them in the late 1500s and brought them more so in the 1600s, the Native Americans over time are going to steal them and then trade with other tribes for them. Also, some are going to escape and create wild horses populations on the Great Plains. And they reproduce fairly rapidly, not as rapidly as other animals like rabbits or something, but their population over the course of a couple hundred years grows. And it's by the mid to late 1700s that all the Native American tribes that eventually live on the Great Plains states have domesticated horses. And in fact, if it wasn't for the domesticated horse, there wouldn't be near the amount of Native Americans that live on the Great Plains. It allows them to now travel alongside the herds of bison and elk to hunt. And so the way of life that we see glorified in movies, such as the movie Dancing with Wolves, where there's a famous bison hunt. It's one of my favorite scenes of a movie because it's really great cinematography by Kevin Costner. I don't even know the movie's historically inaccurate because the Sioux actually had firearms and the Pawnee didn't, and they portrayed the opposite. The Pawnee were the aggressor, but that was actually the opposite. The Sioux were the aggressor, but that scene is so incredible. But that was only about a 200-year development because of if 200 years at max, more like 150 years when that scene was supposed to have taken place in history. And so it's because of the Spanish bringing the horse to the American Southwest. Okay. Now, in 1680, the Pueblo actually revolted against the Spanish, and it's an incredible revolt, and it was successful initially. And they slaughtered the Spanish and drove the Spanish out for 14 years. And so what ends up happening is the Spanish come back. In fact, a lot of the Spanish that survived went down to San Antonio and El Paso into Texas. But they eventually come back 14 years later and subjugate the Pueblo Indians. And they took all the adult males, cut off their right foot, and marched them back to Mexico City, as you can imagine, where they died of infection. And so it's incredible to what happened. Now, we're going to talk about the British, we're going to talk about the French, we're going to talk about the Dutch. But really, by the 7 Years' War, it really wasn't clear who was going to control North America. That's going to shape forever American history. Is it going to be the British? Is it going to be the French? Because it certainly looked like it was going to be France. Is it going to be the Spanish if they continue to expand? Now, at this point, probably not. The Dutch had already been given up New Amsterdam, which to the Duke of York, which later became New York. But we're going to see that what's going to happen is that Spain had the largest territory in the Western Hemisphere, but they eventually stopped expanding. Where the French are going to have probably the second largest, thanks to a lot of their holdings in Canada, the Mississippi River Valley. But they are going to be continue to expand, while the British are going to be the least extensive of the three, but are going to be some of the most expansive, okay, trying to go west of the Appalachian Mountains. And of the three empires, Spain treated the Native Americans the worst. France treated them the best, and Britain was kind of in the middle. France sent missionaries out to go live amongst the Native Americans instead of trying to force them to live with them and assimilate. And so that is one of the cool. France has treated them much better. Of course, some of the French priests were brutally slaughtered and skinned alive and burned alive and so forth. But France is going to develop some of the great, much better relationships with Native Americans, give them gifts and kind of sucked up to them. And so that's why you'll see colonial military conflicts. The Native Americans are going to fight typically on the side of the French. And then we'll talk about the British and how they treat them as well. We'll come back to another topic.